In the fog-shrouded redwood forests of Northern California, March 1932, while the rest of America was learning new words like breadline and Hooverville, a woman named Clara Dunning stood in a clearing with 3 children clinging to her skirt and watched her husband's truck disappear down the logging road for the last time. He had not said goodbye. He had not explained. He had simply loaded his clothes into the cab, taken the strongbox with their savings, all $47 of it, and driven away without looking back. He left behind a wife of 12 years, 3 children under the age of 10, a rented cabin with 2 weeks left on the lease, and a note on the kitchen table that said only, "I cannot do this anymore." Clara Dunning was 31 years old. She had no family to return to, no skills that anyone would pay for in the depths of the Depression, and no idea how she would feed her children past the end of the month. The company that owned the cabin would evict her in 14 days. The company store had already cut off her credit. The other logging families, struggling with their own troubles, offered sympathy but could spare nothing more. In 2 weeks, Clara Dunning and her children would be homeless in one of the most remote and unforgiving landscapes in America. What happened over the next year would become one of the most remarkable survival stories these forests have ever known. A story of a mother's determination, children's resilience, and a tree so ancient and vast that it became something no one expected: a home. If you are not subscribed to this channel, now is the time, because this story will change the way you think about what a family can endure and what shelter can mean. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from, and let me tell you about the woman who raised her children inside a living giant. The redwood forests of Humboldt County in 1932 were a world unto themselves. Trees that had been growing since before the Roman Empire rose 300 feet into the air, their trunks so massive that early settlers had driven carriages through tunnels carved in their bases. The forest floor was a cathedral of ferns and sorrel, perpetually shrouded in fog that rolled in from the Pacific and hung in the branches like ghosts. It was beautiful, but it was not kind. The winters were wet and cold, the summers were damp and cool, and the isolation could break a person's spirit faster than the weather could break their body. Clara had come to this place as a young bride, following her husband Henry from their family's farms in Oklahoma to the promise of steady work in the lumber camps. For 8 years, Henry had cut down the giants while Clara kept house in a succession of company cabins, each one more remote than the last. She had borne 3 children in these forests: Thomas, now 9, Margaret, 7, and little Samuel, just turned 5. She had learned to live with the fog and the rain, with the isolation and the rough company of logging families, with a husband who grew more distant with each passing year. She had not learned how to live without him. The first 3 days after Henry left, Clara did not leave the cabin. She sat at the kitchen table, reading and rereading his note, trying to understand how 12 years of marriage could end in 11 words. The children moved around her like small ghosts, sensing that something terrible had happened, but not understanding what. Thomas, old enough to grasp that his father was not coming back, took charge of his younger siblings, feeding them from the dwindling supplies in the pantry, keeping them quiet while their mother stared at nothing. On the 4th day, Clara Dunning got up from the table, burned the note in the stove, and began to plan. She had 2 weeks before eviction and almost no money. The company store would not extend credit. The nearest town was 15 miles away, and she had no way to get there except on foot. Even if she reached town, there was no work for women, especially not women with 3 young children in tow. The county poorhouse was an option, but Clara had heard stories about what happened to families there, how they separated children from mothers, how disease swept through the overcrowded dormitories. She would die before she let strangers take her children. There had to be another way. Clara began walking the forest in the hours when the children napped, searching for something, anything that might offer a solution. She walked the logging roads and the game trails, the creek beds and the ridge lines. She walked until her shoes wore through, and she had to wrap her feet in rags. And on the 9th day after Henry's departure, 5 days before she would be thrown out of her cabin, she found it. The tree stood alone in a small valley, about 2 miles from the logging camp, separated from the main groves that the lumber companies had marked for cutting. It was a coastal redwood, but unlike any Clara had ever seen. Its trunk was not the straight column typical of its kind, but rather a massive, bulging base that flared outward like the skirts of a giant. At ground level, the trunk measured over 60 feet in circumference, and at its base, facing away from the prevailing winds, was an opening. Clara approached slowly, almost reverently. The opening was perhaps 5 feet wide and 6 feet tall, an archway into darkness formed by some ancient injury, a lightning strike or a fire that had hollowed out the heartwood while leaving the living sapwood intact. She stepped inside and found herself in a space larger than any room in her cabin. The hollow extended upward into darkness, but at ground level it was roughly circular, perhaps 15 feet across. The walls were the living wood of the tree itself, reddish-brown and surprisingly smooth, curved like the inside of a cathedral dome. The floor was soft, with centuries of accumulated duff, dry and springy underfoot. And despite the fog outside, the interior was dry. The living tree shed water like a ruth, channeling rain down its bark and away from the hollow within. The air inside smelled of cedar and earth, ancient and clean. Clara reached out and touched the wall, feeling the grain of the wood beneath her fingers, sensing somehow the life that still pulsed through it. The tree was not dead. It was not even dying. It had simply made room, had created this space within itself where something else might live. She thought of the stories her grandmother had told her as a child, stories of spirits that lived in trees, of forests that protected those who respected them. She had never believed those stories, but standing in this hollow, she understood why people had told them. She noticed other things as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. Small openings higher up in the hollow where light filtered through. Natural windows that would brighten the space during the day. A section of the floor that was slightly raised, drier than the rest, perfect for sleeping. A natural shelf where the wood curved inward, already shaped to hold supplies. The tree had not just created a space, it had created a home. All it needed was someone willing to see it. Clara stood in the center of that space for a long time, looking up into the darkness above, feeling the presence of the ancient tree around her. The tree was still alive, still growing, still adding rings to its massive trunk. It had been standing here for perhaps 2,000 years, had survived fires and floods and earthquakes and the arrival of humans with their saws and axes. It had survived everything the world had thrown at it. And now, perhaps, it would help her survive too. She did not tell anyone about the tree, not the neighbors who came to offer awkward condolences, not the company foreman who came to remind her of the eviction date, not even her children. Not yet. She spent the next 5 days preparing, gathering supplies from the cabin that she could claim as her own, scouting the route from the cabin to the tree, planning how she would transport 3 children and their possessions 2 miles through dense forest. On the morning of the eviction, When the company foreman arrived with 2 men to clear out the cabin, he found it already empty. Clara Dunning and her children had vanished in the night, leaving behind only the furniture that belonged to the company and a cabin swept clean of any trace of their 8 years of habitation. The foreman assumed they had walked to town, perhaps caught a ride to the county seat. He filed his paperwork and thought no more about it. He could not have imagined where they had actually gone. The first weeks in the tree were the hardest. Clara had brought blankets and cooking pots, a small amount of food, matches and candles, and the few tools she could carry. But the hollow tree was not yet a home. It was a shelter, nothing more. A dry space out of the rain where they could sleep without freezing. The children were frightened and confused, especially little Samuel, who cried for his father and could not understand why they were living inside a tree. Margaret adapted more quickly, treating it as an adventure, a fairy tale come to life. Thomas, the oldest, said little, but worked alongside his mother with a determination that made Clara's heart ache with pride and sorrow. They needed fire for warmth and cooking, but Clara was terrified of burning down the tree that sheltered them. She solved this problem by building a small fire pit outside the entrance, ringed with stones from a nearby creek, positioned so the smoke would rise away from the hollow. They cooked there and warmed themselves there, but slept inside the tree, where the walls held the residual warmth and blocked the wind. They needed food, and Clara had brought almost none. She set snares for rabbits using wire she had taken from the cabin. She learned to identify the edible plants of the forest, miner's lettuce and wood sorrel, the shoots of ferns in spring, the nuts of tan oak trees in fall. She found a creek with trout and taught Thomas how to catch them with a line and hook made from a bent pin. They ate simply, but they ate, and slowly, Clara's fear of starvation receded. They needed the hollow to be more than a cave, and this was where Clara's transformation truly began. She had never built anything in her life, had always depended on her husband for such things, but now she had no choice. She studied the hollow, measured it with lengths of string, and began to plan. The floor was first. She and Thomas gathered flat stones from the creek and laid them in the areas where they would walk and work most often. Between the stones, they packed clay dug from a nearby bank, creating a surface that was level and solid. Over this, Clara laid the braided rag rugs she had brought from the cabin, creating islands of color and softness in the earthen room. The walls came next. The living wood of the tree was beautiful, but cold to the touch. Clara gathered bundles of dried ferns and grasses and wove them into mats that she hung against the walls, insulating the space and softening the curves of the interior. She left gaps where the wood was most beautiful, treating those sections like windows that looked out onto nothing but the ancient heart of the tree. Light was a constant challenge. The entrance let in some daylight, but the interior was dim even at noon. Clara fashioned candle holders from clay and positioned them around the space, creating pools of warm light in the evening hours. She made a simple lamp from a tin can filled with rendered animal fat, with a wick of twisted cloth that burned steadily and gave off a soft glow. By the end of the first month, the hollow had been transformed. There were sleeping areas for each child, marked off by hanging blankets, each one personalized with small treasures gathered from the forest. There was a kitchen area near the entrance, where the light was best, with shelves carved into the soft inner wood to hold their meager supplies. There was a sitting area with stumps for chairs and a larger stump for a table. And above it all, the hollow rose into darkness, a natural chimney that drew out smoke and stale air and let in fresh. The people of the logging camp did not know where Clara Dunning had gone, and for a while they did not care. The depression had made everyone focused on their own survival, and a vanished family was simply one less mouth for the community to worry about feeding. But rumors began to circulate in late spring when a trapper reported seeing smoke rising from a valley that should have been uninhabited. When a logger claimed he had seen a woman and children walking a game trail miles from anywhere. When someone found small footprints near a creek where no children should have been. Frank Reeves, the camp foreman, decided to investigate. He was a practical man who did not believe in ghosts or wild stories, but he also did not like mysteries in his forest. He organized a small search party and set out to find the source of the rumors. They found Clara in the small clearing outside her tree, teaching Thomas how to clean a rabbit. She looked up at the approaching men without surprise or fear, wiped her hands on her apron, and asked if they would like some tea. Frank Reeves would later say that the moment he stepped inside that hollow tree was the moment everything he thought he knew about the Dunning family changed. He had expected to find desperation, squalor, a family on the verge of starvation waiting to be rescued. Instead, he found a home. Not a makeshift shelter, not a temporary refuge, but an actual home, warm and dry and organized, with children who looked healthy, and a woman who looked stronger than she had ever looked in the logging camp. He asked Clara why she had not come to the camp for help. She told him that no one had offered help that did not come with conditions she was not willing to accept. She said the county wanted to take her children. She said the camp wanted her gone because a woman alone was a problem no one wanted to solve. She said the tree did not want anything from her except to be treated with respect, and that was a bargain she was happy to make. Frank did not know what to say to that. He left with his men, promising to tell no one about what he had found. But of course, he told everyone. By the end of the week, half the logging camp had made the 2-mile trek to see the woman who lived in a tree. The reactions were mixed. Some were amazed, even admiring, calling Clara the bravest woman they had ever known. Others were horrified, insisting that living in a tree was no life for children, that the county should be called, that someone should do something. A few of the wives brought food and clothes for the children, practical charity that Clara accepted with quiet gratitude. A few of the men offered to help build something more substantial, a real cabin nearby, but Clara declined. She had a home, she said. She did not need another one. The skeptics, of course, predicted disaster. William Hartley, who ran the company store and considered himself an authority on everything, was the most vocal among them. He declared that a hollow tree could not possibly sustain a family through winter. He said the first real storm would flood the hollow, or the tree would fall, or the children would sicken from the damp and the cold. He said Clara Dunning was a fool, and her children would pay the price for her foolishness. He gave them until Christmas, maybe less. William Hartley had never been wrong about anything in his life, or so he believed. Clara Dunning was about to become his first lesson in humility. Summer passed gently in the redwood forest. Clara expanded her home, building a covered area outside the entrance where she could cook in rainy weather, constructing a small smokehouse for preserving meat, creating a garden in a sunny patch where vegetables grew slowly but steadily in the cool climate. She discovered that certain crops thrived in the filtered light and rich soil of the forest floor. Lettuce and spinach, root vegetables, herbs that flavored the simple meals she prepared. The children adapted to their new life with the resilience of the young. Thomas became a skilled hunter and fisherman, spending hours by the creek perfecting his technique, learning the habits of the trout and the salmon that ran in autumn. He built his own bow from a yew branch and learned to shoot with accuracy that amazed even the experienced hunters from the logging camp. By the end of the first summer, he was providing more meat for the family than they could eat, trading the surplus for supplies they could not make themselves. Margaret took charge of the garden and the gathering of wild foods, developing an encyclopedic knowledge of the forest's bounty. She learned which mushrooms were safe to eat and which would kill you. She learned where the huckleberries grew thickest and when the acorns were ready to harvest. She learned to make tea from pine needles and medicine from willow bark. Her mother taught her what she knew, but Margaret's knowledge soon exceeded Clara's, a repository of forest wisdom that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Little Samuel, too young for serious work, spent his days exploring the forest under his mother's watchful eye, building a knowledge of the land that would serve him for the rest of his life. He named the birds and the animals, tracked their movements, understood their behaviors. He could tell you which way the deer would run before you startled them, where the bears denned in winter, when the salmon would return to the creek. The forest was his classroom, and he was its most devoted student. Fall brought rain, endless rain, that turned the forest floor to mud and swelled the creeks beyond their banks. Clara had prepared for this. She had dug drainage channels around the tree's base, directing water away from the entrance. She had gathered and dried enough wood to last for months. She had preserved food in every way she knew, smoking, drying, salting, storing in the coolest corner of the hollow where the temperature stayed constant. When the rains came, the Dunning family retreated into their tree and waited them out in comfort, while the logging camp struggled with leaking roofs and flooded roads. Winter arrived in December with the first frost, and with it came the real test that William Hartley had predicted. The storm began on a Tuesday, a cold front sweeping down from Alaska that collided with the warm Pacific air and created a weather event that the old-timers would talk about for decades. The wind came first, gusts of 50, 60, 70 miles per hour that bent the mighty redwoods like grass and sent branches crashing to the forest floor. Then the rain, not falling but flying horizontally, mixed with sleet and hail that stung exposed skin like needles. Then the temperature dropped, and the rain became snow. Heavy, wet snow that accumulated on branches already stressed by wind and pulled them down with sounds like gunshots echoing through the forest. In the logging camp, 2 cabins lost their roofs. The company store flooded when a creek changed course and ran straight through the building. 3 men were injured by falling branches, one seriously enough that he would never work again. William Hartley spent the worst night of his life huddled in the back of his ruined store, watching his inventory soak in 4 inches of muddy water, wondering if he would survive until morning. 2 miles away, in a hollow tree that had stood for 2,000 years, Clara Dunning and her children played cards by candlelight. The tree did not care about the storm. It had survived countless storms, had bent with winds that toppled lesser trees, had shed snow loads that would crush a cabin flat. Its hollow interior was insulated by 3 feet of living wood, maintaining a temperature that stayed remarkably constant regardless of the chaos outside. The entrance faced away from the prevailing wind, as Clara had noticed the very first day, and the covered area she had built deflected the worst of the rain. They could hear the storm raging outside, could feel the tree sway slightly in the strongest gusts, but inside they were warm, dry, and safe. They emerged 3 days later into a transformed forest. Trees were down everywhere, branches and debris carpeting the ground, the landscape almost unrecognizable. Clara led her children carefully through the wreckage, checking on the garden, the smokehouse, the creek where they drew water. Everything had survived. The tree had protected not just them, but everything they had built in its shadow. When news reached the logging camp that the Dunning family had weathered the storm without incident, the reaction was disbelief. Frank Reeves organized another expedition to confirm, and what he found silenced even the most vocal skeptics. Clara's tree stood undamaged amid a forest of destruction, her children healthy and well-fed, her supplies intact. She offered the visitors hot tea and dried venison, served in a hollow tree that was warmer than many of the cabins they had left behind. William Hartley did not join the expedition. He could not bring himself to face the woman he had so confidently predicted would fail. But he heard the stories, saw the amazement in the eyes of those who returned, and knew that he had been wrong in a way that would follow him for the rest of his life. The storm broke something in the community, some barrier of skepticism and judgment that had kept them at arm's length from the Dunning family. After the storm, people began to visit not out of curiosity, but out of genuine interest. They wanted to know how Clara had done it, how she had turned a hollow tree into a home that outperformed their own cabins. They wanted to learn. Clara taught them what she could. She showed them how she had managed drainage and insulation, how she had positioned her fire to avoid danger while still providing warmth, how she had stored food and preserved supplies. She explained the principle she had discovered by accident, that the massive walls of living wood acted as a thermal buffer, absorbing heat during warmer periods and releasing it when the temperature dropped, maintaining a more stable interior climate than any wooden cabin could achieve. She showed them the natural ventilation created by the hollow's height, how warm air rose and escaped through the openings above, drawing fresh air in through the entrance below. The logging wives were particularly interested in her methods of food preservation. Clara had learned that the tree's interior, with its constant cool temperature and low humidity, was perfect for storing dried foods. She had created a system of hanging baskets and shelves that kept supplies off the floor and safe from insects. She had discovered which local plants had natural preservative properties and used them to extend the life of her stores. By the second year, she was preserving food more successfully than women with proper root cellars and spring houses. Some of the men offered to help her build additions, and this time Clara accepted. They constructed a small wooden platform outside the entrance, covered with a sloped roof that extended the living space without touching the tree itself. They built a proper door for the entrance, one that could be closed against the worst weather, while still allowing smoke to escape and fresh air to enter. They helped her construct a more permanent smokehouse and a chicken coop that she stocked with birds traded for her surplus preserved foods. She did not have all the answers, she admitted. Much of what she had done was instinct and improvisation, but the results spoke for themselves. Over the following years, Clara's tree became something of a landmark. Visitors came from other logging camps, from towns along the coast, even from as far away as San Francisco, to see the woman who lived in a redwood. A newspaper reporter wrote a story about her that was picked up by papers across the country, bringing letters from strangers who admired her courage and wanted to know more. A photographer took pictures that would end up in a book about the redwood forests, documenting a way of life that would never be repeated. Clara never sought the attention, never tried to profit from her story. She simply lived her life, raising her children in the only home she had, teaching them the skills they would need to make their own way in the world. Thomas grew into a young man who could build anything and survive anywhere. Margaret developed a knowledge of plants and healing that would later make her a respected herbalist. Samuel, the youngest, became a naturalist who spent his life studying the very forests where he had grown up. The tree remained Clara's home for 23 years. She lived there until 1955, when age and declining health finally forced her to accept her daughter's invitation to move to a small cottage in town. She was 74 years old. She had entered the tree as a desperate mother with 3 young children, and she left it as a grandmother, a legend, a symbol of what determination and ingenuity could accomplish. The tree still stands today. It is protected now, part of a state park that preserves some of the last old-growth redwoods in California. Rangers lead tours to see it, telling the story of Clara Dunning and her children to visitors from around the world. The hollow is empty now, cleared of the furnishings and tools that Clara accumulated over 2 decades. but you can still see the marks she left, the places where she carved shelves into the wood, the smoke stains on the ceiling from thousands of cooking fires, the worn places on the floor where generations of feet walked the same paths. What Clara built in that tree was more than shelter. It was proof that home is not a place, but a decision. Not a structure, but a commitment. She had nothing when she entered that forest. Nothing but 3 children who needed her and a determination that would not bend. She emerged with a legacy that has inspired people for nearly a century. The lesson of Clara Dunning's life is simple, but easy to forget. When someone takes everything from you, they have not taken your ability to build again. When the world writes you off as lost, you are not obligated to accept its verdict. And when you find yourself with nothing, standing in a forest with children who depend on you and no idea how you will survive, sometimes the answer is not to search for what you think you need, but to recognize what is already there, waiting to be transformed into something no one expected. Henry Dunning, the man who abandoned his family in that forest, was never heard from again. Some said he died in a car accident in Oregon. Others said he made it to Alaska and froze to death in a mining camp. Clara never spoke of him after the day he left, never answered questions about him, never expressed either anger or forgiveness. He had made his choice, and she had made hers. History remembers only one of them. The redwood forests of Northern California are among the most ancient and magnificent places on earth. Trees that were saplings when Christ was born still stand there, monuments to endurance and patience and the slow accumulation of years. Most of them have never been anything but trees, but one of them, for 23 years, was something more. It was a home, a refuge, a testament to human resilience. It was proof that even when someone leaves you with nothing, nothing can still become everything. What would you do if you found yourself abandoned with nothing but your children and a forest? What would you build? What would you become if the world expected you to fail? Drop your answer in the comments below, and if this story moved you, if it made you think differently about what shelter means and what families can endure, consider subscribing to this channel. We tell stories like this one every week, stories of people who refused to accept the limits others placed on them. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell, and I will see you in the next video. Because somewhere out there, right now, someone is standing at the edge of a forest with nothing. And maybe they're about to discover that nothing is enough.